piece of quarter-sawn Bubinga, and I'm going to try and use that for this process. I recently made a prototype smoother because I hadn't built a smoother, traditional style smoother before. And I like the way it turned out really well, so that's what I'm going to style the smoother after. The jack and the joiner, they'll start out similar to this, but I'll make a raisy style where they'll be cut down about an inch, and then they'll have an enclosed handle. Or at least that's the plan so far. We'll see how it goes. So the first thing I need to do was look at the board that I have and do some layout to make sure my grain orientation is correct. And I'll bring the camera in closer and show you what I'm talking about. Alright, there's several things we need to consider as far as grain orientation on our plane. And this one shows a real good example of one of those. If you can see on camera, the grain tends to run downhill from the toe to the heel in this direction. So if it was the hairs on a dog, they'd be running this way, and when you run the work by the plane, it makes that grain want to lay down against the bottom of the plane. Whereas if this were the toe, your fibers are running this way. As you run your work across, it wants to grab those fibers. So this is what we want. We want it to run downhill in this direction. The other thing we'd like to have, and we don't have on this because this is a laminated plane, but we'd like to have our grain running across, straight across on the ends. That's going to be a little bit of a challenge on this board, so I'll show you what the end grain looks like.
This is a quarter sawn board. Unfortunately, quarter sawn can run anywhere from 90 degrees perpendicular to the face of the board to about 60 degrees from the face of the board. This one's probably closer to 60.
Now, where that gives me a small problem is I'm making this plane in two pieces, or two halves. So if I take these two that I've cut already and turn those up, what I get is one continuous, it's not a 45, but it's a probably a 35 degree angle or 30 degree angle here that runs all the way through. The problem there is I don't know if that will eventually cause the plane to twist or warp. What I'd like to have in this case is the grain on one side running up, and then when it hits the glue line, run back down in the opposite fashion in a mirror image, so that hopefully that will counteract any warpage or twist and make the plane a little more stable. And I can show you an example of that. Let me back this out just a little bit and aim it up a little higher. What I'll do is flip this one around. Now here you can see that once I flipped it around is that I have grain running this direction and this direction. So they are more of a mirror image, but they're not exactly a mirror image because this board is 4 feet long. So I've got another plan to make the toe of the plane, each half match very close. This is how my board looked before I ripped it on the bandsaw. And what I showed you just a moment ago on the end grain orientation, I'd flip these two upright so that the bandsaw edge is on top. Now what that does, it gives me the wrong end grain orientation, but it gives me a nice mirrored image on the top. Unfortunately, that's probably not going to be as important as the end grain. So I can't just take these two, measure out a length, cut it off, and then glue those together, because that's not going to work. So instead, what I'm going to do is take, for instance, this will be my joiner plane, it'll be 24 inches long, is cut it here, take these two ends and match them up. I should get the correct end grain orientation and a real nice mirrored image on that end grain. So that'll end up being the toe of my plane. Now earlier I showed you this plane and the grain orientation on the sides that's running downhill. On my Bubinga, where I cut my line here, these two ends become the toe of my plane. On this side, it's running downhill the correct direction. It's a lot more subtle than the maple plane. But on this side, it's running the wrong direction if this becomes the toe. So this is about 3.5 inches tall, and I only need about 3 or maybe 2 7/8 of my finished plane. So what I've decided to do is strike a line from this end and let it run uphill and make a cut, so that on the bottom of this board the grain will end up running in the correct orientation. Then I'll just put the two together, make the bottoms match up, and then rip the top to where it's parallel to the bottom until I get the correct height. And that should solve the downhill problem.
Here I'm using sandpaper on a granite surface plate to flatten the glue surface of the smoothing plane. I need to make sure that it's dead flat and that there's no gaps after they've been glued together that'll create any voids in the mouth opening. So this is the best way I can find to do it.
I've got my usual setup here on the CNC. I've got my two halves of my plane opened up like a book and matched on one end. The center line between them is the Y0, the end is the X0. I've got a sacrificial piece of plywood sandwiched on the outside, so when the cutter comes out it'll hit the plywood and not chip out the top of the plane. I've got the two pieces clamped together as well as clamped down to the table. We should be good to get started. Alright, there's the plane after the CNC gets finished. We're 3/4 deep at the cheeks and about 1 1 15 thousandths at the abutments where the blade will go, so that'll give me about 30 thousandths of side play for the blade. Okay, here's the plane right out of the CNC, the two halves here. And of course when you put together it's extra wide here, but when it's finished it will end up being the same size and shape as this prototype here. That leaves me a little meat when I cut around with the bandsaw, that the blade doesn't kick out the side of the part and just makes it really hard to get a smooth cut. This way I can get a nice even smooth cut and keep the blade engaged the whole time.